I wanted to ask you, speaking of regimes, about your time in Israel.
Now you're going to end the last supporter I have watching this.
All right. No, no, no.
Israel's been a hard one for me, as I sure, it's not just that my mother is Jewish and suffered terribly, by the way, in a part of the world now where we say, oh, they all love freedom, Lithuania and the Baltics. My mother worked for making drapes for the Radziwiłł family associated with the Kennedys over the Lithuanian Polish area. She worked very hard as a young worker in Lithuania and lived in the Jewish Pale and was the victim of a very serious anti-Semitism in Lithuania. She knew something about the Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, and so forth. And my father was a German farm boy, Protestant, and I had a hard time to this day. I get along very well with my German relatives, but what did you do during the war and so forth? Very hard. And so I must say, when I went to, I was in Israel and Egypt at the end of the 6-Day War. I was in Egypt first because I was able to get in there through Michael and Sarah's father. I forgot his name, but he was Harvard SDS, but he was had been worked for the Arab League. I got in there. It was very strange. I always said I'm Jewish. I'm not going to lie to anybody. And then I went over to Israel, and my first hours in Israel, I just felt like, yeah, I returned, and it's great, and Tel Aviv, and all these Jewish people, after all, in the Bronx, sometimes we had other people say we killed their Lord or something. I said, wait a minute, only half of me did, but they didn't accept that. So I understand all those feelings that the Jewish people needed protection and so forth. And when I went there, I got into the West Bank, and I got into Gaza, and I talked to people. And I had actually been in Egypt, and I could see the Egyptians control Gaza. And it was no paradise. They controlled the Palestinians, just as the Jordanians had controlled the West Bank, just as Syria had controlled the Golan Heights. And they were not heroes of mine. They hadn't liberated the Palestinians. And I actually was somewhat influenced by Moshe Dayan, who I saw in action there, and Alon and other people who were in the Labor Party, who claimed to be social democrats, who were enlightened leftists, who said they liked the Ramparts magazine or things that we were writing about. And but then I saw very early on there, while I was there, that they weren't going to develop a multi-state where they were basically going to push these people out, and do ethnic cleansing. And I warned them. And they would actually, in the course of an interview, I remember Moshe Dayan, I remember saying to me, if you come back in 10 years and you find we're still occupiers here, we will have failed and Israel will have failed. I remember that very clearly. I wrote articles suggesting that, and perhaps they were sincere, because the Labor Party was made up of people and there were allies in other political parties, and in the kibbutz movement. The kibbutz movement has supplied, I think, over 90% of the officers in the Israeli army. And by the way, I've interviewed a guy, Abraham Shabbat, who was the mayor of Nazareth, I believe, who had donated blood to the Israelis in that 6-Day War. And the Israeli Arabs I met were not hostile to Israel. They were conflicted about what's going to happen to the Palestinians. And the question was, would Israel withdraw from the occupation and work out a peace deal? And for all the blame they visit upon the Palestinian leadership, and there is blame, the fact of the matter is Israel failed that challenge. And they did the very thing that the people in the Labor Party that I interviewed, Pellet is his name. His father was a big general. He does
Miko Pellet.
he does very good writing,
Yeah.
and has for a long time about this. His father was one of the generals. There's a very good movie about Israel's and torture, imprisonment. I'm blocking on the name. An Israeli-made movie that basically interviews former leaders of the Shin Bet.
What is it called?
It's a movie that everybody should
A
watch.
documentary, right?
documentary, and these people say very clearly, we failed. They were the ones who administered this.
The
They said,
gatekeep the gatekeepers, that's what it's called.
gatekeepers. They were the gatekeepers. I think it's probably the most important single thing you should check out if you want to think about this irreconcilable difference. And if you're going to be, I don't care whether you're Russians imprisoning Ukrainians, Ukrainians imprisoning Russians, whatever it is, you become the occupier, you become the monster. I remember when I went to Germany, I found my family, and my father, my brother, my half brother had bombed Germany because, as opposed to the Japanese, the Germans were trusted to go fight. And my half brother was in the Army Air Force, and he was a bomber, and he bombed that area. He wouldn't visit. I was the first person from my German side of my family to go visit Germany. And my father, my uncle, they wouldn't have anything to do with them. They were strong anti-fascists, and they saw that even with Spain. So I went back to find my relatives, and my uncle. I found my father and my brother in Germany, and he had been wounded in Stalingrad. A guy named Ludwig, and I got along great with them. And he said, wait, we're farm boys. We were drafted, and we talked about it. And his children were already young children. They were already pacifists. They were in the UNOUNS. They didn't want to join NATO. There was a strong peace movement in Germany. And I said, wow, kindred souls, the same way I felt about somebody's Labor Party and leftists in Israel. Well, where are they now in Germany? I'm not talking about my relatives, who I think are great, but where are the German people? Do they really want to be dragged into this whole NATO madness and go to have another war with Russia? It didn't go so well the last time, What are they talking about? And so when I think about, you're talking about Israel and Palestine, people don't like it when I say this, but the Palestinians are the Jews. They are the people in the diaspora. They are the people who have, been their basic right as human beings to be governed in a way that they can say something has been taken from them. And if it goes on a few years and you work something out, okay. But it's been a long time since I was there, right? Okay, it's been more than a half century when I was told by leaders of the Labor Party, come back in 10 years if we haven't ended this occupation and these people don't have their rights in some kind of, whether separate confederation or separate countries that get along, what have you. They weren't that clear on the details, but if we're occupiers, we're going to be monsters. They were very clear about that. Their religion taught them that. Their history in the diaspora as Jewish people taught them that. I didn't get any arguments from anybody in Israel about that at that time. And I had, as I said, I'd been in Egypt when Nasser resigned. I've been there when they were defeated. So I found, and there were quite a few people, not as large as them, but there were Egyptian Jews I talked to who understood that, and all that's been lost now. And in fact, Israel now, and the Jewish people that you mostly hear about are quite conservative, and you don't hear, I'm trying to read notes that people are saying, I don't know, people disagreeing with me. We're going on and
No,
on.
no,
Okay,
actually,
because
they don't.
to me, this is very sad. I'm not a religious person, and by the way, I don't think the Old Testament is a very enlightened book. Frankly, there's
Pretty
a lot of
vindictive.
stuff about killing homosexuals and being hostile to a lot of different. You can find more in the Old Testament than in the New Testament. So I'm not biased that way, but I have you can't grow up the way I grew up and not feel a strong identity with the Jewish people who lived in the diaspora and were victimized so brutally, and of course, not just, and I shouldn't say not just, obviously, in the pogroms in World War II, but historically, and not feel that sympathy for the Palestinians. And by the way, when I was at the LA Times, we did some polling that I was involved with of the Jewish community in the United States. And if you asked a question, they would come out with predictable, Israel has to be protected and all that. But if you ask them the second or third question, can Israel be made safe if it's occupying due to Palestine? They almost all of them came out on the side, on our enlightened side. That's why you have more Jewish people that have been in the peace movement as a group per capita than any other. You have more Jewish people speaking out about the oppression of Palestinians than any other per capita than any other group, you know, whether they're journalists or elsewhere. It's because if you're really a product of this Jewish tradition, then you're a product of oppression and you don't want to be the oppressor. I mean, that came with my mother's milk. You know, my mother hit the ground here becoming a labor organizer as a garment worker. She thought that's what you do as a Jewish person, you know, and your fellow workers are Italian, they're Black, they're Puerto Rican, they're your allies. And, you know, you look at the civil rights movement, the Jewish participation is the thing that Jewish people should be proudest of, right? I mean, I was involved. I went to the South in as early as 1960, you know, and Jewish people, including, not enough, but including quite a few Southern Jews, were sticking their neck out. Not enough, but certainly if you look at the civil rights movement, the Jewish, well, then if you care about civil rights in a fundamental way, you got to care about Palestinian rights. Come on.